The White House has issued an urgent warning following renewed nuclear rhetoric from Russian President Vladimir Putin, marking one of the most dangerous moments in the Russia-Ukraine war since its outbreak. The warning comes amid intensified Russian military pressure, large-scale missile and drone attacks on Ukraine, and a firm Ukrainian military response backed by continued Western support. More than 3 years into the conflict, the war has entered a phase where nuclear signaling, strategic deterrence, and battlefield escalation intersect in ways that deeply concern policymakers across the globe. While no nuclear weapons have been used, the increased frequency of nuclear threats, doctrinal changes, and public statements from Moscow have forced Washington and its allies to speak with unusual urgency. This moment reflects not only a military escalation, but a profound test of the global security order established after the Cold War. The White House warning followed a series of statements and actions by the Kremlin that U.S. officials described as reckless and destabilizing. Russian leadership has repeatedly emphasized changes to its nuclear doctrine, signaling that Moscow may consider nuclear options under broader circumstances than before. These statements were accompanied by high-profile military exercises involving strategic nuclear forces, reinforcing concerns about escalation. U.S. officials responded by reiterating that any use of nuclear weapons, whether tactical or strategic, would fundamentally alter the conflict and lead to severe consequences for Russia. The administration stressed that nuclear threats must not become normalized tools of warfare or political coercion. At the same time, Washington reaffirmed its support for Ukraine's right to defend itself under international law, emphasizing that deterrence and stability remain the guiding principles of U.S. policy. Russia's nuclear rhetoric has been a recurring feature of the war, but recent developments have elevated alarm levels. The Kremlin has framed Western military assistance to Ukraine as direct involvement in the conflict, arguing that long-range weapons, intelligence sharing, and economic sanctions amount to a proxy war against Russia. From Moscow's perspective, nuclear signaling serves several purposes. It aims to deter further Western military assistance, reinforce domestic perceptions of strength, and pressure international actors to reconsider their support for Ukraine. However, Western intelligence assessments continue to indicate that Russia's threats are primarily strategic signaling rather than preparations for imminent nuclear use. Despite this assessment, the risks of miscalculation remain high. The White House warning emphasized that even rhetorical escalation carries dangers, particularly in a conflict involving nuclear-armed states operating in close proximity. Officials underscored the importance of maintaining communication channels, avoiding misunderstandings, and preventing actions that could spiral beyond control. While diplomatic contacts between Washington and Moscow remain limited, both sides continue to communicate through military and diplomatic backchannels designed to reduce escalation risks. On the battlefield, the warning coincided with a significant escalation in conventional warfare. Russia launched some of its largest missile and drone attacks of the year against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, targeting power generation facilities, transportation networks, and military sites. Ukrainian authorities reported civilian casualties, widespread power outages, and damage to critical infrastructure, as winter conditions intensified the humanitarian impact. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described the attacks as an attempt to break civilian morale and weaken Ukraine's ability to sustain its defense. He renewed calls for air defense systems, ammunition, and continued international support. Ukraine responded with targeted military operations aimed at degrading Russian capabilities. Ukrainian forces have focused on striking logistical hubs, ammunition depots, and military assets used to sustain Russia's campaign. These operations are designed to disrupt Russian operations while remaining within the boundaries of conventional warfare. Western officials have repeatedly stated that they support Ukraine's right to defend itself but do not seek direct confrontation with Russia. This balance, supporting Ukraine while avoiding a wider war, has become increasingly difficult as the conflict evolves. The United States has emphasized that its assistance is defensive in nature and intended to restore stability, not provoke escalation. However, the Kremlin continues to portray Western involvement as existentially threatening, feeding a narrative that justifies aggressive rhetoric and posture. Internationally, the situation has raised deep concerns among NATO allies. European leaders have warned that nuclear threats, undermine global security and increase the risk of accidental or intentional escalation. NATO has increased vigilance along its eastern flank while reiterating that it does not seek conflict with Russia. Alliance officials have stated that no evidence currently suggests Russia is preparing to deploy nuclear weapons, but they have acknowledged that the strategic environment has become more volatile. NATO's response has focused on deterrence, readiness, and unity among member states. Beyond Europe, the conflict has global implications. Energy markets remain unstable, supply chains have been disrupted, and food security concerns persist in vulnerable regions. The war has also accelerated debates about nuclear deterrence, arms control, and the future of international security institutions. Countries outside the Western alliance face complex choices as they balance economic interests, diplomatic relationships, and security concerns. The conflict has highlighted divisions in the international system, with some nations calling for negotiations, while others emphasize accountability and deterrence. Diplomatic efforts to end the war continue, but progress remains limited. Ukraine has insisted that any peace settlement must respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia has maintained demands that Western governments and Kyiv consider unacceptable. The White House warning reflects a broader recognition that the conflict has reached a critical juncture. Nuclear rhetoric raises the stakes in ways that extend far beyond Ukraine and Russia. A single miscalculation could have consequences felt across continents. U.S. officials have stressed that deterrence still works, but only if all parties act responsibly. They have urged Moscow to refrain from nuclear threats and return to diplomatic engagement. At the same time, Washington has made clear that intimidation will not succeed in altering U.S. support for Ukraine. For Ukraine, the message is equally clear. The country remains determined to defend itself, even as the risks grow. Ukrainian leaders have framed their resistance not only as a national struggle, but as a defense of international law and the principle that borders cannot be changed by force. As the war continues, the balance between deterrence and escalation will remain fragile. The White House's urgent warning serves as a reminder that nuclear weapons remain the most destructive force ever created, and that their use or even the threat of use carries consequences no nation can fully control. The coming months will test whether diplomacy, restraint, and international pressure can prevent the conflict from crossing a catastrophic threshold. What happens next will shape not only the future of Ukraine and Russia, but the global security order for years to come.